Are we all set? Okay.
So to get this started, if you could, we'll just go around, state your name, the position you're running for, and then why you decided to run, what your interest in Parks and Rec is. We'll start here.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Travis Davis. I am a 12-year Bend resident, moved here when we were pregnant with our first child. We've got 2 boys now, 10 and 12 years old. Very active involved in youth sports. That's a big deal in our house, as well as using the river for floating and all sorts of parks amenities. We've been heavy users and beneficiaries of a great parks department for our 12 years in Bend. So that's kind of number one, why I would run, is I want to see that continue. It was why we moved here, and I know it's an attractant for a lot of people who move to Central Oregon. So I don't want to see the parks go downhill in any way. I am an engineer, a civil engineer and a builder. That's my background. Worked in that field for 15 years and then worked in risk management for the past 4 years. So I think those skill sets lend a unique perspective to the board as the Parks Department undertakes major projects, both on the construction side, logistics. I know how those projects are well managed, and I can provide kind of a high level oversight to ensure that we're using the public funds to their highest and best use, as well as the risk management side. And I already think the Parks does a great job executing operationally. I've spoken with their risk manager. They already excel in this area, so just kind of continued support in planning for long-term risk management. And why particularly now run for the board versus maybe years past, and what issues have bubbled to the surface that make me want to run? Diversity of representation, I would say, is kind of the first major issue, which is there are no East Side residents on the board. And East versus West in this town has been an issue for a few years. It was identified a few years ago as a major issue in city council races as well. For the Parks Board, it really comes down to an affordability issue. The East Side of Bend has an average household income of $34,000, whereas the West Side is $73,000. That's more than a minor blip. That's a huge obstacle to East Side residents in using Parks facilities. And so without an East Side resident on the Parks Board, that voice isn't being represented in the way I feel it should. When you talk to East Side residents about affordability, it's hey, I can't even go to Juniper because it's $28 for my family of 4 to go to Juniper Pool. Or I can't go ice skating because it's $44 for my family of 4 to go ice skating at this public amenity that we've built. That's a very different conversation under the same term affordability if you lived on the East Side versus the West Side. And then secondarily, it's collaboration. I sit on the Bend Economic Development Advisory Board. I see how the city of Bend works internally and with outside organizations to work for the betterment of all of Bend. And I think the Parks Department could be a more collaborative partner in those citywide conversations. So affordability being one, affordable housing, as well as transportation and funding of other community needs.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so my name is Ariel Mendez, and I'm also running for the Bend Parks and Rec Board, position number 1. I'm also a father. I've got 3 kids who are growing up right here in Bend. I teach political science at OSU Cascades, and my wife is a pediatrician at St. Charles. I've been an active community volunteer for a long time. I'm on the city's Transportation Advisory Committee. I've been a Safe Streets advocate for a number of years. I'm the board president of Bend Bikes. And I've also been on the budget committee for the Parks District. This is my 3rd year on the budget committee. And I feel like I've gotten to know a lot of different organizations in the city. I've gotten to know the city's working with the Transportation Advisory Committee. I know a lot of the city councilors. And I know the Parks District pretty well through my experience as a budget committee member and also a soccer coach. So the reason why I'm running is I feel like there is an opportunity when 2 positions are going to be open, and I thought about the kinds of experiences that I've had as a member of our community and what I bring to the table, and I thought that there might be an opportunity to extend a lot of the community volunteer that I've already been doing in a different way. So I think it's pretty hard to imagine Bend without its parks, without all the great playgrounds, the trails, the opportunities that are there for recreation, and also a lot of the programs that the Park District provides. And I'm running because I want to help the Park District think more broadly about its unique role in our community. I think that with as many issues that are facing our community, issues like affordability, transportation, access and inclusion, the Parks District has a role to play there. And I want to help the Parks District with solutions to those kinds of problems. One example,
We're going to do a deep dive into
Okay.
issues, so if it's an issue,
sounds good.
we'll rotate. So, well, let me just start with you because it's this question is a budget. You know, parks have been criticized for being overly funded. Do you support that notion, and why?
You know, I think it's a reflection of the unique position that the Parks District plays in Bend. It's pretty unusual to have a Parks District that is this well funded. And when I first got to Bend, people told me that one of the things that people support is just a lot of great public services. And it turns out that one of the reasons that we have so many great public services is because we have these separate districts, separate library district, community college district, and a separate Parks District. So that means that the Parks District funds cannot legally be used to pay for things like potholes or other services that are essentially city services. I think that the obligation here is to say, well, what kind of value are we actually getting for that money? What kind of services is the Parks District providing? What kind of amenities is the Park District providing? So I think that when you think of the role that the Parks District plays in, for example, affordable living, access to things like childcare, summer camps, affordable recreation opportunities, a place to teach your kids how to swim at an affordable rate, the Parks District brings a lot to the table. I think that it can do more, and I think that I support the Parks District doing things like assessing its SDCs in a tiered approach that incorporates the principle of the ability to pay. I think when you leave that out, it should be no surprise that we end up with an affordability problem. So I think that it's absolutely incumbent on us to have this conversation about how are those funds being used, what kind of value is the community getting out of them.
Are parks overfunded, as I understand the question? I don't think I'm ready to make a judgment call and say yes or no categorically, but I think the perception is there and it's there for a reason. I think you have to look at two things, the tax base and the SDC rate. So the tax base at $1.40 per thousand is quite high relative to other parks districts around the state. And you have to look at how that came into being, and that was an artifact of what we had on the books when Measure 5 and 50 came through and it got locked in at a certain rate. We've all benefited from that rate for years in terms of excellent facilities. I don't think rolling back that rate is something the Parks Board would be willing to take on, and I don't think it's their role. SDCs are another matter. So SDCs, when I moved here in 2006, were about $6,000 a house, and the average house SDC was a total, so all the city SDCs combined, including parks, was $18,000. So you're going to build a new house, $18,000 goes to infrastructure development. Nowadays that number is over $25,000, and the parks has grown to $8,000, and it's set to increase even further. And so I do think that is an issue. We're building countless more homes today than we were building in 2009 to 2012. Those homes each carry an SDC charge of maybe $6,000 to $8,000. Why continue increasing it per home when we're able to build the type of infrastructure that we already currently enjoy at $6,000 a home, and we were able to do that for a long time. I don't think the per home charge needs to increase. So affordability to live here is dependent not only just on SDCs, but it's dependent on accessibility and park fees. And so you brought it up as well, Ariel, and I'll echo it. We need to be equitable so that lower income families have more access. And I know the other board member, Jason, that's definitely one of his keys as well. I'm glad all three of us think that way.
We'll get into that a little bit more, but I'm just curious, Ariel, as a member of the board, the budget committee, what was your take on, the discussion to raise SDCs that's going on right now in parks? And have you had a role in it?
Yeah, so SDCs are set by basically two things. One is you look at what the expected needs are. So with so much growth projected to happen in Bend, the Parks District tries to figure out a way to accommodate that growth. And the cost of construction, and also the cost of land. So when SDC fees are assessed, it's a mixture of looking at what do we think the park needs are, and what do we think the cost is going to be to provide those needs. So when construction and land costs increase, you have to increase the cost to develop those projects in order to keep pace. So the Parks District has essentially indexed SDC funds to construction and land costs, and that's something that not every government agency does. So for example, in Redmond, they haven't done that, and the gap in funding is readily apparent. And what happens is now they have to do a big jump to catch up, and that comes as quite a shock. And so making that jump is much harder than if you say, well, we need to be cognizant of what our expected needs are and what our costs are. If the growth doesn't happen, the SDC funds don't materialize either. And so there's kind of a nice balance there between having, if the expected growth doesn't happen, then the expected funding doesn't happen because the SDC funds are tied to increasing that capacity. So it's a challenging process. My take is I would like to see the Park District focus more on trail connectivity. Right now, trails are only 10% of the capital budget and 7% of the maintenance budget. So rather than say focus on trail extensions, I would like to prioritize trail connections. So that's not necessarily a question of spending more, that is a question of priorities.
So it sounds like you were in support of, as in your position on the budget committee of what's going forward with the SDCs.
Yeah, I don't think that the answer here is let's slash the budget. I think when you talk about things like affordability and access to parks and programs, I don't think that these are programs that we need to be cutting when there are huge questions of capacity for things like Kids Inc. or summer camp programs. These programs sell out overnight. PAC sold out in 2 days this year. And when there's a wait list for things like recreation classes, you can't provide access without also providing the funding. So I don't really see that the solution to Bend's affordability problem here is let's slash the budget. I think the role that the Parks District has to play is in providing these kinds of daily access to things like recreation classes or childcare after school.
Do you want to respond to that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
If it's appropriate. So as I understand the question, it's kind of what do we think of the process and the methodology? And I was not in the budget committee meetings. So what I saw from the outside was more the result of, I think, a 6-month plus long process. And I don't want to be overly critical here because I wasn't in the room, but what I saw on the backside of that was an increase in SDCs per home requested. What I really liked about the process was the gradation of home size and starting to look at maybe a luxury home should pay a little more than an affordable smaller home. Love that methodology, and I think they were going the right direction there, so kudos on that one. What I did not like was starting to step into commercial SDCs. I felt like that's a little double dipping because all the people in your office here, the majority of them probably live in Bend, probably already paid SDCs in the homes that they live in to enjoy the facilities. Now, if you were to upgrade your office and move to a new location, you would then have to pay for more parks that you've already paid for. So I'm not a fan of double dipping in that regard. What I think the crux of the problem is, I like the idea of spending more on programs like Kids Inc. and Ariel and I think are really well aligned, but that's a need in our community that we need to spend money on, so that's great. Where I think we can find that money though, rather than slash the budget, that's definitely not where I'm at, but what needs to be included in an SDC or a tax budget? Look at the Larkspur project. I'm a fan of that project. If that came across to voters as a bond measure, I would have voted for it. I actually voted for the pavilion and for the Whitewater Park, which most of my friends did not vote for. But I'm a fan of giving the choice to the voters. And this is a $23 million building, indoor space that has traditionally been proposed to voters as a bond measure, not just paid for because Parks put it on the plan, Parks Board approved the money, and we have a big bucket of money in SDCs and taxes. We have a surplus. Let's just put it toward a $23 million building. I don't think that's prudent. I think we need to ask voters, do you want this, before we spend $23 million of public money.
Are you seeing the apparent dovetail here into the big question of public funds?
Why don't you go ahead, because I might not be where you are.
Well, of course, Mirror Pond is a big discussion, and it sounds like the city wants the parks to have more of a buy-in. I think we have, as a board, have advocated in the past for that being put up for a public vote. So I'm just curious about where you stand on the Mirror Pond issue. Should parks take more of a role? And, frankly, do you believe that, again, that should be something that voters should have, input on? So.
I think we'll start over here.
Sure. I do believe that Mirror Pond needs to be addressed. As a community, it's a community treasure and a jewel and a centerpiece for our community that we need to ensure is not a stinking wasteland, right? There's been a ton of research put into this. There's private entities, there's public entities that have all researched possible solutions, and I have not been to all of those meetings, so I'm not going to act as an expert here. But what I will do is step back to the 30,000 foot view. Does the city have an obligation? Yes. Do the private landowners and the Pacific Power have an obligation? Absolutely. Does the parks have an obligation? Based on funding alone, absolutely. The parks funding, they enjoy a rather generous tax base, and this is a parks amenity that they can definitely help the city and the community. And then to your point, Nicole, I think is a very good point, and I haven't heard it brought up before, is why isn't this in some way, shape, or form put in front of voters? It's very similar to my point on Larkspur. I have a lot of trust and faith in sending this type of question to voters and letting them speak as to where they want their money spent, because ultimately it is their money.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify something though, because last night Travis gave me a hard time for not raising my hand and asking questions about SDCs as a budget committee member. This is my third year on the budget committee, and I'm puzzled by that because I don't actually recall you attending any of the budget committee meetings, so I don't know.
The minutes are public though. I've read the minutes.
But I don't know how you would know whether I raised my hand or asked a question. I mean, other than the budget tour that which I first met you a couple of weeks ago,
Sure.
Have you attended a single budget committee meeting?
Not at all. But the minutes are public, and I have read the minutes. And so my point there was, if affordability was a concern for somebody on the budget committee, and SDCs were continuing to climb in that case, I would probably not approve the budget. I would vote against the budget that included an increase in SDCs and not an affordability, an affordable housing exclusion. That was my point there.
So
I'm just going to bring this back to Mirror Pond.
Sure.
I mean, I think point made.
So I think that affordability is a really big issue as well, and frankly I'm puzzled why the question on Mirror Pond is dredge or not dredge, and I'm also puzzled by my opponent's support for spending $7 million or more on dredging Mirror Pond. I think that the state of the conversation around Mirror Pond needs to be elevated. I don't feel like we're actually evaluating all of the options on the table. It's got to be more than dredge or not dredge. Mirror Pond is absolutely beautiful. I do agree. It's an icon. It's part of Bend's history. But I think there are big questions that have not been answered that dredging alone does not address. So the dam is a big one. Just a couple of years ago, Pacific Power changed its mind about the future of the dam. Given the history of maintenance on that dam, I think we can't really invest that much money in dredging Mirror Pond until we have confidence about the future of that dam. So I think there's lots of conflicting values and unanswered questions that we need to get to before we say, let's spend $7 or more million on what is private property right now. And the fact that this private property owner is holding up the public process is a problem. So,
Which you mean the dam owners or the Mirror Pond owners of the?
well, as I understand it, the land below Mirror Pond is owned by Mirror Pond Solutions.
Right, okay. I just
And-
wanted to clarify,
yeah.
since we have two private entities going on in this scenario.
Yeah, so when people say things like when the Eiffel Tower needs a coat of paint, you give the Eiffel Tower a coat of paint. But the city of Paris is the owner of the Eiffel Tower. And I think that allows for the public process to take place. And we don't see that happening in the case of Mirror Pond.
Shoot, lost my train of thought.
Do you support
Sorry.
sending it to voters?
I think that anytime you can get more public involvement in the process is a good thing, and I support more public involvement in general. For example, making right now the Parks Board minutes are available, but they're not recorded, they're not live streamed. I think that we can promote transparency and probably build more trust in that regard. So in principle, I think that's a good idea.
I guess my question was, who takes the lead on the Mirror Pond issue? And if you feel like you want to get back in on that, it's great as well. Who should lead if we're discussing what are the multiple options? Is that a Parks decision, or is that a thing that Parks brings up? Like, hey, let's look at all the options.
Well, given that it's owned by a private entity, I think it's puzzling to have it be such a big question for public funding. That's a huge amount of public money to be spent on what is a private asset. So I would say we need to take a step back until we can address the concerns about the public process.
Thoughts?
Yeah, from what little I know about the topic, so let's just be clear that I'm no expert on Mirror Pond, but Mirror Pond Solutions was formed to facilitate this process, and yes, it is privately owned, but as I understand the intent of it was to facilitate the ability for Mirror Pond to be beautified for public good. So I don't think it's strictly private landowners trying to beautify private land. So I need to learn more about the process. I think as far as who should lead, though, this is a City of Bend issue. I'd like the City of Bend to lead. I'd like City Council to lead, and I think the Parks is, if City of Bend is 1, Parks is 1A.
So just not to keep beating it, but city leaders have said this is a Parks issue. So where does that, it's just like, who's going to bend there? If it's just throwing the volleyball back and forth.
Great question. So I've talked to multiple city councilors about this issue, and this goes back to collaboration, one of my 2 key points in my campaign. Parks Board and City Council need to work better together, and they've had a history of butting heads, but I really think that with the tenor on City Council lately and kind of 2 new Parks Board members, there's an opportunity here for them to work together.
Okay. Did you want to respond to
I think I would be happy to have it be a Parks District led project, subject to the clarification of who actually owns the land. The Parks District has a history of doing projects on the river and around the river, so I think in principle, I think that I'm okay with that.
Okay. You guys have talked a lot about equity and access, and so, I think that is an important issue. One thing that one of our recent stories that we did, looking into the budget, it looked like there was the pot of money that goes to give people discounts. There was a lot left over in that pot last year.
Unused, yeah.
So I'm just curious, if there's this conversation and we got all this unused funds, it doesn't seem like there's, we're talking about, we don't have enough in that kitty. It's just that, what are the barriers that are not, people aren't accessing those funds, so.
Yeah, I think communication, getting that out to the populations that need to hear that, yes, we invite you to come use Juniper Pool, because many of those people who are underprivileged are really not banging on the door and asking if they have funds available for scholarship, because they're not educated. So I think Parks can do a better job in terms of educating, whether it's non-English speaking populations or just underserved populations. I think we're in similar alignment on that. I really appreciate Ariel's position on that as well.
Yeah, I think there is a question of communication here. I've done work with the Latino outreach specialist at the district to try to develop a strategy of taking advantage of the existing networks in underserved communities to try to improve those lines of communications. But another reason why the funds have not historically been used is because it's very difficult to actually take advantage of them. For example, up until very recently, and about 2 months ago, it was the case that you had to verify your income twice a year. And I always felt like, if it's good enough to verify your income once a year for the federal government, that ought to be good enough for the Parks District too. So it's a question of how easy it is to actually take advantage of the funding. And then there's the question of whether the funds actually go far enough. So I think it was 2 or 3 months ago, actually, a letter in the Source about a woman who said, I'm living at the poverty level on a fixed income. I qualify for the funding, but I still can't afford it. I think that's a problem, and I'd love to see that addressed. So part of it is communication, and part of it is making sure that it's actually accessible as a real opportunity for people.
Okay.
Both of you have spoken about being dads, and you've got kids in the Park District system playing sports. Ball fields is a never-ending need. Do you feel that currently Park District is addressing the need for more fields? And again, this can be an equity issue. What are your thoughts on that? I think we went to you first. We'll come over here.
Yeah, so this is an area where the population projections for Bend, I think we have about 26% of the population is under 18, and that's not expected to go down. So with all the growth, demand for sports field is going to be increasing. I think the Parks District has an obligation to stay ahead of that in terms of providing them. Sports fields are expensive. You've got to make sure the grade is right. You've got to make sure that it's compact enough so that it doesn't sink, but not so dense that it doesn't drain. So they're expensive. The Parks District is involved with partnering with the school district in providing some of those fields and provides a lot of its own fields as well. So I support that kind of capital expansion to ensure that we have those kinds of amenities available. I'll stop there.
Well, do you think that they're currently in a projection-wise, are they ahead, behind, on the spot for developing this?
So one question though, sports fields are used for a variety of uses, and I think that there is an opportunity, for example, to work more closely with some of the Little League organizations to make sure that their needs are being met. I don't see any principal distinction why a kid who wants to play Little League is going to have fewer opportunities than a kid who plays soccer. If there's enough demand for it, then we need to find this field space to make that happen. And so there's some work there to be done on partnerships to make sure that those opportunities are available.
I'd say we're operating in an extreme deficit from a field space issue. So the boom in lacrosse in recent years, they get last rights to a lot of fields. They don't have fields to practice on. Soccer, which is a sport we both coach, which is great. Then Parks&Rec has nearly enough fields for its own purpose, but then what it doesn't have is fields for club ball, and so you've got clubs begging for fields, and now you've got Bend Timbers doing a public-private partnership, which is excellent. And I also have kids in the Timbers program, and I'm affiliated with them. And so I've seen that be a wonderful way to deliver fields to the public, which are going to be multi-use fields. You're going to have lacrosse and soccer using them, and we're not actually using Parks dollars to build the fields. That model could be expanded for whether it be Little League or lacrosse. I actually looked down at Medford Sports Facility. I think it's 137 acres of turf sports facility, and they host a number of events, and they claim it's an economic development boom for them that kind of opportunity brought to us so that it not only is an expenditure, but it's also a potential revenue generator for the city and for hoteliers and shop owners here in Bend. There's a real opportunity there. So when I look at the Parks Department spending $23 million on Larkspur versus potentially taking it out to voters and saying, hey, what would you rather spend money on? We have this money to spend. That's a missed opportunity in my mind.
Yeah, do you feel like the Timbers facility is going to solve field issues for the community?
And that's only one. No, I feel right now that's going to fulfill 15% of the need, just to throw a dart at it. Like I said, we're in a major deficit position. We need 20 ball fields, not 2.
You want to respond, or we're good? Okay. Chris?
Curious what your guys' priority projects are for, if you get to the board, for people that ride bikes, the big bike park that keeps bouncing down the road and keep hoping it's going to get done. That's one example, but, what do you guys see as the big priorities for you?
So I think access in the general terms is a priority for me, and part of that is thinking about our urban trails as a means of getting places. This is not something that's historically been a focus for the district, and I think that's a huge missed opportunity. And in many cases, it's just a matter of building a better connection or providing more wayfinding signs. For example, downtown, the connection from Looney Bean to the Deschutes River Trail is a series of stairs, and what people on bikes have done is they've basically worn a dirt path next to the stairs. I've helped a man in a wheelchair trying to meet his family down there. I don't feel like it's good for accessibility, and I don't feel like it's good for trail users who are using it to actually get to places like downtown. So I would love to see the Parks District focus more on thinking about how people are getting around and not just in terms of the destinations. And that goes for the sports fields too. I've seen kids riding bikes, 10, 12 years old, out to Big Sky. That is not a safe road. Hamby Road, it's a major collision area, and it's not safe. I think we can do much better in that regard. And at the end of my tenure, I would love to see the shift of the ratio of what we spend on parks as destinations and what we spend on trails shifted a little bit. I think that we can do better, and that kind of investment and that connectivity is going to pay off for the entire community.
So Chris, I'm going to answer in probably a non-standard way, which is I don't have a set agenda. A lot of my friends, so youth sports is a natural. I could say I want to build a ton of youth sports fields, and a lot of my friends say that should be my number one issue. Yet, I think what the Parks Board needs is better listening and less advocacy. The Parks Board doesn't need members to come on and say, I want to build X and Y and Z. I don't need another hockey arena. I don't need a whitewater park. What Ben needs is good listening. I think Parks Department does a pretty good job on gathering community input on what type of recreational opportunities people are looking for. There's a ton of survey work there, and that data that comes back is well-rounded. What I think they could do better in terms of data collection is prioritization of where people want to spend their money. Because right now the surveys look a lot like, do you want another X, and not who's going to pay for that, but just do you want it. So they need to have a cost as well as the benefit in front of them.
I was kind of curious about surveys, and you sort of answered something about what I was thinking, but I was just curious, have you dove into whether those surveys are, reaching the populations that you guys have talked about in terms of low income or, like our Latino population? Just, are those, has Parks done a good enough job reaching those communities?
Great question. I don't know the answer to that question. That's an important question to ask though.
Do you know anything about that?
So the Parks District does perform a public perception survey every 2 or maybe 3 years, and it's statistically valid. So to the extent that it is able to sample effectively randomly, those voices should be represented in there. But when you talk to underserved families, it's clear that things like transportation is the #1 barrier, and that's what the Latino outreach specialist tells me, and that's what I hear from families too. It doesn't make sense for us to, as parents, to have to pick up your kids after school, drive them to the soccer field, drop them off, and then for 45 minutes go back to work and then have to come back and pick them up again. If there's a way for kids to get from school to the soccer field or whatever sport or activity they're doing afterwards that is safe and convenient and doesn't rely on their parent or their guardian leaving work to do it, then I think that's where we need to be spending our time. And I don't think that it would even cost that much. This is a question of focus and priorities. So I think that there is work to be done there, and I think that I fully support it in terms of reaching out and building on some of those networks that already exist in underserved communities and ensuring that the Parks District is partnering with them.
So just kind of dovetailing on that, and I guess, you know, it's probably hard for you to take off your hat for Ben Bikes, but it's great to have a trail that's connected, but, you know, what about the kids who don't have bikes, don't have skateboards, don't have, you know, does Parks have a role to, you know, help those kids actually get around beyond maybe a bus or whatever it is? I'm definitely curious to answer as well.
Well, that follow-up question, so does Parks have a role to play? You know, kids without bikes, kids without skateboards, they still walk, and so the trails are still an absolutely valid point. So where Ariel is going with logistically helping kids access parks and schools and their communities via safe trails, as a parent of attending a 12-year-old, I'm in full support of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at what the needs are, and in some cases it may make sense to either provide or partner with an organization that can provide a van. If transportation is a barrier and walking might not be an option or biking isn't an option, then I think you find other ways of doing that. And one way to do that, for example, might be partnering with Cascades East Transit to give a discount to people who go to Juniper. Juniper is a couple of blocks from Hawthorne, and I don't see any reason in principle why the Parks District wouldn't want to encourage the use of transit to access its facilities. So I think there might be an opportunity to partner on things like that too.
Do you think that, and this is for any public entity, the balance between boards and their staff, do you think that the park board currently provides enough oversight of staff, and would you characterize that relationship between staff and the board as being a healthy one? I can't remember, lost track.
I think Travis went first last time.
All right.
So I think in general terms, it's reasonably good. I think that there is a tendency for the staff to set agenda where there's an opportunity for the board to be a little more active in actually saying, no, this is what we think are priorities and we want to make sure that we're following through on that. And I think that's natural for, in general, any board or city council. The staff has a lot of influence in terms of setting that agenda. As a board member, I would want to make sure that there are opportunities to say, you know, this is what we want to spend our time talking about. And I think there's an opportunity to do that. I'm not, as a board member, to be clear, you're not running the day-to-day activities of the organization or the government. You're working primarily with the executive director. And when staff comes to present, it's informational. Oftentimes the agenda is set by staff, and so there's an important opportunity there to say, to play a role for oversight and accountability for the public, to say, are we actually achieving what we think is in the public's interest?
Yeah, and do you think the board currently provides that kind of oversight?
Given my own assessment of what I feel like is a missed opportunity to do things like provide connections, you know, when you look at the issues that people are facing in Bend, transportation is at the top of everybody's list. Congestion has risen to the top over affordability in the last public survey that the city conducted. So I feel like this is an opportunity where, you know, we need to say, what role does the Parks District have in thinking about how people get around? I feel like that's a missed opportunity. That's something that I'd like to see changed.
As far as balance between board and staff, I think we've got to recognize that we've got a very high-functioning staff. We've got a very strong executive director who's executing their operational plan at a very high level. I'm a big fan of how they're doing operationally. I do think that, and this is again from the outside, so I'm not sitting in the board meetings, but from reading the minutes that I've read, both board and committee minutes, I do feel like the staff runs the show. The board is potentially a bit of a rubber stamp. I've heard from one budget committee member who was also a budget committee member for Deschutes County. And he said the process, I said, how's Parks Budget Committee going for you? And he said the process is 180 degrees different. He said at Deschutes County as a budget committee, we really dug into the details. We really set the agenda and had the staff do the legwork and come back to us, and there was an iterative process there. He said at the Parks Budget Committee, really the staff presents a 99% complete budget. Everybody says that looks great, and they move on. And that's an anecdotal characterization. I wasn't in the room, but to me, what I would like to see there is I would like to see a more active board in setting the agenda and being responsive to community needs and to other organizations like City Council.
You feel like you could be that guy?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the reason why I'm here, right? I'm not here to build more parks or more trails. I'm here to make parks work for the entire community and balance. What I'm recognizing is it's the same wallet that all of our tax dollars come out of. And if we've got a real need for, whether it's affordable housing or transportation or other infrastructure growth, those same people need to be able to tell all of the entities, parks, city council, everyone, these are our priorities, focus on these first. It is great that we're a separate taxing district and that I think if we were all living through 2008, 9, 10, and the Parks Department was subservient to the city, our parks would not be in nearly as good a shape today as they are. So,
as someone who was actually in the room for those committee meetings, and I know who Travis is referring to, I don't think that he's actually characterizing, and I think he would agree that Travis is mischaracterizing the way those meetings are conducted. There are lots of questions asked. In fact, that's what we spend most of the time on. The fact is, a lot of the times there's well thought out responses to the questions, and everybody gets an opportunity to say, is this question answered to your satisfaction, or do you think that there's something else that we need to be doing? And so, for example, last year, I and another budget committee member got together to say, you know what, we think that the Parks District could be doing more to reach out to underserved communities. And we could be doing things like hiring bilingual receptionists at Juniper, things that will make people feel more welcome at the facilities. And the staff responded to that. And so we saw that kind of back and forth. There's always something more that you can do. But I don't think I wouldn't characterize it as a rubber stamp process. I think there is an active dialogue and lots of questioning that goes on.
So in those meetings, are you looking at the surveys to gauge, at the same time what the public is wanting?
So there's an opportunity to ask about them. I mean, generally you're looking at the particular funds, what kind of priorities you think they're making, but setting those priorities doesn't happen in the budget committee. Setting those priorities is what happens at the board level. And so in January for the Parks District, they have a priorities meeting where they set things like what is the rate of subsidization for access to programs like Juniper. That's a board level question, not a budget committee question.
Okay.
Well, we're reaching the end of our time here. I'd like to give you guys the opportunity to bring up anything that we may have not asked you about that you feel is pressing, and then segue into reiteration or new take on why you're the candidate that should get the endorsement. I think we'll start here.
Sure. Yeah, thank you again for the opportunity. I really appreciate the questions. As you mentioned, this is our last hurrah in terms of going through this process. So this is coming to a close of learning a bunch for me. I want to thank Ariel as well. I've learned a ton from him, and I do think that although we have some positions that are different, I think about 95% of our service will look a lot the same, and I'm proud of that. I'm proud to have him serve. My particular focus is on diversity of representation. The east-west divide in Bend is a very real thing, and it's certainly not Ariel's fault or any of the board members that they don't live on the east side, but it's difficult to represent an underrepresented group when you don't live there. As I went door to door on the east side, I heard things from those members that frankly I don't think you hear when you go door to door on the west side. Diversity of representation and then collaboration amongst other city entities so that we can prioritize large city needs like affordable housing. Those are really my two main issues that I'm running for the board. Thank you.
Great.
So I just want to share a story. My kids go to Bear Creek Elementary School, and almost half the kids there are students of color. Over 95% of the students qualify for the free or reduced lunch program. And as I've gotten to know these students and their families as a coach and as a volunteer with the PTO, I was also on the site council for a couple of years, I got to thinking about a lot of the political issues that we're currently facing, questions of whether you belong or whether you don't belong, things that people wonder about, whether they're welcomed on the basis of things like their skin color or the language that they speak. And I was taking one of my son's friends back to his house, and he lives in an apartment next to a park, and as we rounded the corner, he turned and he looked out at the park and he said, "There's my park." And I thought that really speaks to the ability of parks to make someone feel welcome, to make them feel like they belong, and even give them a sense of ownership in the community. And I think that's really powerful, and I think that's something that we shouldn't overlook. And with as many needs as there are in this community, I don't think that we need to be talking about cutting the Parks District budget. I think what we need to be talking about is ensuring that the Parks District activities and the public investments that it makes adequately reflect the needs and the values of our community. So we need to find creative ways to expand access, to provide affordable recreation classes, and to provide affordable after-school programs for kids. So I think that I'm in a good position to support those goals, and I do think that experience in this regard counts for a lot. I've worked with a lot of different agencies in Bend, and I feel like I'm in a position to support that kind of collaboration.
Great.
Well, thank you both for coming in. We're all in debt for your service and your willingness to put your name and your face out there in this process and go through things like this. And I'm sure both of you should be elected. It would be great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate the process.
And really, I owe Travis a debt of gratitude too. This has been a learning process for me as well, and having these kind of conversations, these are the most important conversations.